I think I'm going to persevere for a little bit longer so that there will be a natural break and ask that you Q-sort these. We've got 15 items, and then once we get the Q-sorts, I'm going to get Xerox copies of a few of these so that we all have a common data set. You'll all do the Q-sort, but I think probably 6 Q-sorts, and we all have the same 6, and we can then enter those and use that as the basic data set. Normally, we would include everyone, but we don't want to have to spend the rest of the afternoon keystroking in a bunch of Q-sorts. As far as the distribution is concerned, we have 15 items. It's unrealistically small, but if we had that and wanted to provide a spread for those in terms of the Q-sort distribution, really the distribution doesn't matter, the range doesn't matter. We could, with 15, you could ask people to completely rank order them from 1 to 15 if you wanted to. That's a relatively small number. But the more important considerations, after all the statistics have been talked about, are very practical things like how much space does the person have? Do they have a big desk or a little desk? You know, concrete kinds of matters, because literally the technical features, the physical features of the Q-sorting don't matter. Stevenson pointed out repeatedly that if you're B.F. Skinner and you're wanting to know whether reinforcements on a pigeon's pecking behavior lead it to start pecking the green key instead of the red key, it does not matter whether it is a green key and a red key or a blue key or a yellow key. It does not matter what the Skinner box is composed of, wood or aluminum. These things merely define the experimental space within which the behavior is going to occur. Similarly here, it almost does not matter which statements. If there are some people who are interested in technical aspects of Q methodology at this particular point in their development, then it almost doesn't matter which one of these technical things is in the Q sample. Those are going to go up the high end because those are the things the person is interested in. If the person, on the other hand, is interested in broad philosophical things and really is not much interested in factor analysis and Q sorting, but finds Stevenson's conceptual ideas of intrinsic interest, has more of a philosophical bent, then it's the philosophical statements, and it almost doesn't matter which philosophical statements you put in there. Those ones are going to go up to the top. That's why, in part, that Stevenson was opposed to any idea of providing a standardized Q-sort. There are a few of them on the market, you know, Q-sort to study executive ability and Q-sorts to study this. The paradigm case, of course, is the California Q-sort, which is a standardized set of statements, which is not to say that these things aren't useful in some kind of way, but from the standpoint of a science of subjectivity, which is what Stevenson was interested in, these things did not matter very much. You can always go back, sample some additional statements, and if you've got factor A, B, and C, and one of them is interested in technical kinds of things, and one's interested in philosophical things, and one is interested in pedagogical kinds of concerns, you can go back, and if you sample broadly, that is, if the Q sample you select the second time round has just as much conceptual breadth in it as the first one did, then you're going to get, you know, a methodological, a philosophical kind of factor, and you're going to get a technical kind of factor, and so forth the second time around, because those are the things that are on people's minds. Yes?
Steve, at this point, I think we could anticipate a question from editors or from students that might say, by building that structure, building the Q sample around the structure of technical, methodological, philosophical, and conceptual, are you not biasing the process to the point where you somehow favor those ideas to in fact come out of the mathematical analysis, the objective analysis, and appear as factors, and thereby interjecting the researcher's own bias in the whole method?
Yeah. Well, the response to that may not inhere in the particular study that you're doing, but there's lots of evidence in other studies in which factors have come out and you've looked at the statement arrangement and grouped them back according to technical, methodological, and conceptual, or do something formal like doing a variance analysis, and discover that none of the things that are built in to the Q-sample structure is actually present in the factors of the individual Q-sorts. As I say, that may not be evident in the particular study that's under review. But as a general principle, there is no guarantee that what goes in necessarily comes out as factors, that you're going to get a technical factor. It may not even come out at all. It may. And when the factors are organized by some kind of theoretical scheme. Stevenson did a lot of studies of introversion and extroversion, Jung's ideas in psychology. And it may very well be that you get factors that come out that look exactly the way the theory predicts. He said that's no evidence necessarily that the theory works either. Because you can imagine somebody who's really a kind of constrained, timid, shy, kind of introverted person who wants everybody to think that they're very outgoing and extroverted, would like to be able to be that if they could get over their constraints, and therefore paint a picture of themselves that looks very outgoing and social, which and Stevenson reported some of those. He had this one kind of sociopathic person, for example, who described himself as being very warm and concerned and so on and so forth. And that's quite characteristic, in fact, of people who perpetrate scams and so forth. They often are very warm and engaging, and that's why they're so good at taking people in. So that just because you got a factor out that is extroverted would not necessarily mean that this person or this factor represents an extrovert, because there's something that's dynamic. And Stevenson never, I mean, in psychometrics, if you perform a certain way, you're intelligent by definition, because you did the intelligence test the way it's supposed to be done. But when you're talking about self-description or your political attitudes and you're wanting to appear very liberal-minded and so forth, from a subjective standpoint, simply because a person represents his or herself in a particular way is no guarantee that that's really what's at issue, because there's something that's dynamic. And that's where he would start digging into things like intensive and extensive. How would you like, you give the person the Q sort again, how would you like for the people to think that you're like? And what kind of person does your spouse think that you're like? What kind of person are you like when you're on the job? And how does your supervisor see you? You could start probing into various social roles of the person and perhaps eventually show that the self-description is not really an honest description, but is the person straining to appear a particular way to the interviewer, or to try to convince you that they're this way rather than that. So I think for Stevenson that the truth or lack of truth of a particular Q sort was a judgmental thing. It never, you could never take it out of the realm of the judgment of the clinician or the observer, because the data had to be interpreted. You might, as a first approximation, take the surface description as good enough, and most studies stop at that point.
Not to be a dead horse, but why wouldn't you just do a random selection of the statements rather than grouping them at all initially? Just randomly select.
Well, if we take the introversion-extroversion, Stevenson initially had 2,000 statements that he took from Jung's psychological types, and he said Jung was primarily interested in introversion, and that the overwhelming proportion of statements that were taken out of those 2,000 that he abstracted from the book, the overwhelming majority of them were introverted in character, and that if he just took a random sample, he would have a Q sample that would have been biased. It would have been more difficult for an extrovert to have expressed him or herself. The introvert, by way of contrast, would have had run into difficulties because there would be statements that the person agreed with that were, they were having to put under -1 and -2 because of the overwhelming. But by balancing it, you've created a situation in theory. Now these are theoretical things. In theory, that an introverted type is going to have just as much ease in representing his or her point of view as the extroverted type. So
I can see in studies like that, but I'm thinking more along the line of studies such as this, where I think with the groupings you have, you could do a random sampling. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't affect.
That's I suppose always possible, but it couldn't serve as a general rule because of situations that you would run into in which it wouldn't work. Whereas here, if you conceptualize things ahead of time, you're always, sometimes we say we will run into a set of statements in which we know that there are some technical things, but nobody mentioned them. You know, there's only one or two. And so to sort of flesh that out, we either interview more people and ask them specifically about technical things, or sometimes just take them out of the literature or think them up and put them in there. That people have an opportunity to respond to that aspect of whatever it is that we're studying that might be underrepresented or even not represented if you just sampled on a random basis. Yes?
I just say to you that you probably do a better job of answering the question that Bob anticipated in your book, the subjectivity. And the question is really about how you reduce what's an unmanageable amount of statements, because in real life you'd have many more statements than this. So manageable
Yes,
to enable
yes.
people to sort it. And these categories are a way of trying to represent the whole diversity of what's complex. And they don't have to be things you came with it yourself to the study. It could be structures that you inductively derived from what you had from interviews. But the way around the question, well, is your induction just something that you brought to the study, is perhaps to ask somebody else who isn't so immersed in the concourse to check out which structures they think are emerging from these statements and see if they're similar to the ones that you've derived, and if they're not, incorporate some of their own. And then I think the neatest thing you say in your book is what you then want to do within these structure categories is to represent heterogeneity as much as possible within those categories, and that's exactly the opposite of randomizing.
Well, yeah, but the issue he brought up was, I think, more the experimental bias. And in a case that's even with introvert, extrovert, what if there was a third category? And Young, who did not believe in a third category, said, I'm not even worried about these at all. And
I think what I'm saying is
away, and those statements are never sorted at all. And there may have been some validity to the third category.
I think what I'm saying is that if you just start with the data you have from interviews or from wherever else you saw the concourse, if there is another category, it should appear as you read the text that you have, which is the...
Let me say also, with and all of those are good points, that typically what you're trying to do, even with these kinds of categories, because these could also be considered as being like attitudes, or some people with technological kind of understanding and interest as far as Q is concerned, and others with a conceptual and so forth, is you're really, in a way, trying to second guess the factors that are in there. Because what you're trying to explain is the concourse. How is it that these things came out as opposed to some other kinds of things? It's because what's on people's mind. And those ideas are being driven by particular kinds of interests, attitudes, orientations, perspectives, and so on and so forth, that aren't explicit until after we've done the study. And we see that, there's factor A, B, and C, and factor A, B, and C are what are causing the concourse to have the particular content that it does, because here are the A's coming in here with this kind of thing, and here are the B's coming in, and so forth. And so this is kind of our first approximation. It looks like introversion and extroversion is what accounts for the different kinds of self-feelings that people have, or that inner direction and other direction and tradition direction and Reisman are the kind of social attitudes that influence things like people's shopping behavior or consumer behavior. Some of the studies that were done in the journalism school here back in the 60s and 70s on those kinds of themes. So you're anticipating in a logical kind of way and building those in and using those as a conceptual framework, but then you relinquish that when you do the factor analysis, because whatever conceptual kinds of categories that you created initially give way to the real categories, which may or may not coincide with these. They might. But again, even if they do, Stevenson was still, you cannot abdicate the need to reach a judgment about that, because somebody may be telling you, oh, I'm very interested in conceptual philosophical kinds of things, but when you actually see what they write about and see the kinds of things they lecture about, they're really technicians or something like that. So.
About the problem of inserting a bias, I mean, one of the things that we talk about Q is that it's an objective way of looking into subjective topics. Now, when you start doing that, you're second-guessing what you're going to be examining. You're inserting your own personal biases into what you might find. How do you answer to that?
Well, I think people in journalism schools know that, particularly in advertising, that you can do your best to try to control the consumer behavior of the consuming public, but when it comes down to it, they have their own interests and biases and so on and so forth. And similarly, you can give somebody a statement that from your standpoint means such and such, and you may find out that when that person responds to it, they're coming out of what to you sounds like left field. So that you aren't really controlling their bias. You put things in there that mean certain kinds of things logically to you, but the person, you know, there's an interaction there.
Yeah, but going beyond this, if you eliminate certain statements that you think would fit into the same category, well, then you're preventing somebody from perhaps manifesting an additional point of view that might exist by using that statement.
Not always. Sometimes that's the case. Sometimes that's the case. If you have really been, that means that the Q sample just isn't comprehensive enough. But if you've taken care to create the Q sample following the principles that are there, that does not happen. It's also possible that, you know, that in the selection of people, you, for some reason or another, have not included people of the factor D type, and so you just never do see that. You know, every study is not the be-all and end-all and the last word about this particular phenomenon. You know, this is why you have things like replication and Q is just as subject to those as anything else. Very quickly, because we're going to have to get on to the...
Somebody were asking Claudio's question. Couldn't we answer with a question back, like why in political science is it that you sometimes don't use random samples to, when your goal is to be representative, but that you'd rather go for a stratified sample because then your likelihood for being representative is increased.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we're doing here.
Mm-hmm.
We're basically not doing a random sample, we're doing a sort of stratified sample. I mean, okay, if I were doing the political polling, I might say, okay, I want some white, some black, some women, some this, and then somebody from this other country there too, because I expect them to perhaps have different viewpoints. So, to me, that's what you've been doing there, right?
Yeah, right.
I mean, so we could refer back again to, hey, look at how you're doing surveys and political polls, you're doing exactly the same thing, right?
Yeah, and the principle that applies to the selection of the people is essentially the same principle when applied to the statements.
We would be okay in answering that way,
Yeah. But
right?
yes,
Question.
but the structuring of the statements typically does not constrain the results that you get. I mean, you get, you build in like liberal and conservative statements, and you go out to study public attitudes, and you get the predictable liberal factor, and you get the predictable conservative factor, but what if you get factors C, D, and E? You know, and you may look at them, and it may be that factor C is another liberal factor. It's quite possible that you would get, and it never occurred to you that there were conservatives, and then there were liberals sub 1, and there were liberals sub 2. They're just liberals. I mean, the popular lore might be that you have liberals and conservatives, so that there's, but then you may have something else that's neither, and nor is it a composite of two of them. It's something totally different, and that can occur even though you have built in, 50% are liberal statements and 50% are conservative statements, because what you cannot control is the kind of meaning that the Q sorter is going to bring to it, and that remains to be found out after you get the factors out.
You touched on this when you were talking about numbering of statements, but I think it's important to point out that you do not tell the subject about the structure that you've either built in or...
Oh, that's right, yes.
You don't do that.
Yeah.
On the point about random selection, the best argument for not resorting to random selection is the number of statements that you're dealing with normally in the Q sample is rather small. And if you're going to resort to a random selection, you want to be able to assume that whatever real differences exist or whatever real structure there is, detected or not, is going to be properly represented in the sample that you choose. And the number of statements is usually such that that's a pretty shaky assumption.
In addition to that, categorizing the statements on the one hand is saying that this statement is of that kind, this statement is of that kind, and so forth. But when a person is Q sorting, you're asking them which ones of these means most, not what does it mean, but +4, which one of these do you most agree with? So you're not really asking them to spit back the same kind of information that went into the structuring of it. You see, so that you're asking for degrees of relative importance, and they may very much agree that yes, this is a conceptual statement, but it didn't matter what kind of statement it was. It doesn't mean much. It has not very much salience, or it does have a lot of salience to it. So some of the principles that are involved are hard to swallow. They do come from a different kind of research and philosophical background. The more, in fact, you've been exposed to standard research methodology, I think the more difficult it is to grasp, because it does involve a kind of inversion of thinking about things in many respects. But I think that the more experience you have with it, which isn't a good argument for it, but nevertheless, the more you have interviewed people after the Q sorting, I think the more you come to appreciate just how resilient the human mind is, that is, of the people who do the Q sorts, and the kind of the breadth of meaning that they bring, and how difficult it is to control much of anything. When you show them these kinds of statements, now there would be a good exercise, I suppose, for someone wanting to contribute to the Q literature, would be not even to do the Q sorts at all, but to give people Q samples and ask them what kind of theory these, represent, to see what kinds of categories they would put them in. And I expect that there's all kinds of different ideas. When people see the statements, all they see is just a bunch of statements. For all practical purposes, it's just a random sample as far as they're concerned. Or their understanding of what might be the structure, and it may be totally different from somebody else's understanding. So I don't think that those are really important constraints as far as the structuring of the statements is concerned.
But the point that you raise right now, I think, is terribly important to this group, because people rarely come to Q methodology naive. They come often with a great deal of experience, beliefs, superstitions about science, which often means R-based science. And you just admitted earlier that there were some things that make it very difficult to accept Q on face value, and rationalizing Q based upon one's experience with Q is not a good argument. It often causes people to reject it. And so we are faced with the duality of a task, not only to teach Q technique, but also to lend a kind of credible acceptance, maybe almost a hucksterism for Q method. Now, we don't want it to come across as a hucksterism, but often it's perceived that way, because it is such a radical departure from ordinary objective science that it is very difficult. The stumbling block is too large for the new audience to accept. And statement number 29, which is in our Q set, is one that for teachers is very, very important. How do you approach this?
We better start quickly.
Yes, yeah. Can we put that, it's a very important point. Let's put that on hold, though, temporarily, because I am mindful of that. It's coming, it's past 3 o'clock right now. But the point I started to make about 30 minutes ago, and then I got off on some other things myself, is it doesn't much matter what the range is. To keep it simple, since they're close quarters and some people don't have much of a desk in front of them, let's say something like from +2 to -2. So if we had -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, as the, and again, it could go from 1 to 15. We could just completely rank order these. So we have 5 categories and 15 statements. That's fortuitous. We could have 3 under each. So you could have 3 under here. It doesn't much matter as far as the distribution is concerned. That too has been contentious in the past. So maybe the simplest thing would be to have 3 under each column, 3 under -2, 3 under -1. So you would rank them here. The condition of instruction would be of the order, what it was that you were looking for by coming to the conference under.
I'm sorry, can you mention about the structure again?
Yeah.
I'm not sure quite.
Of the Q set.
Of the Q sort.
Yeah. Imagine a distribution here, or you can even use the cards to, put a +2 on, and a +1 and a 0.
You don't want a forced distribution, though.
Well, yeah, but put 3 of them under +2. Those 3 statements that would represent closest to your reason for what it was you were looking for from this conference. 3 of them under +1, being those 3 that are next most important reasons to you for coming to the conference. And then under -2, those 3 that you think are most unimportant to you.
When you do a Q-sort, do you necessarily have to have a forced quasi-normal distribution? Because in this case, you wouldn't have. You would have a flat plus, -2 to +2, and you have 3 in each column without having a normal distribution.
Those were the kinds of things that Stevenson was referring to, and he said that it wouldn't matter to the pigeon whether it was a green key or a red key, and it wouldn't matter here whether we had this kind of completely rectangular distribution or whether we only had 1 under +2 and 2 under +1 and 6 of them under 0 and had more of a normal distribution. Any one of those changes in the distribution has practically nil effect.
Have studies been done that determine that whether you do it that way or with...
Yes, yeah.
It gives the same kind of result?
The same kind of result. It doesn't matter because all the information is contained in the ordering and none in the shape of the distribution, or virtually nil. I'm not saying that you get the same correlation coefficient out to the 4th decimal point or anything like that. It obviously has some effect, but it's virtually no effect. And on the...
It does change the way you range your statements.
Yes, yes.
And if you're forced to choose 1 or 2 as most likely, then you will select, you're more likely to demonstrate a certain factor.
Keep that point and raise that point, because that too is an important point, and there's a response to that as well. When you are finished, if you would draw on this white sheet that I will pass around, just take one of these, if you would, and draw a distribution plus -2 on the left, -1, 0, +1, and put the statement score, the numbers of the statements associated with each one of these points along the distribution, and record those so that we know how you distributed. And then if you would put your name, I'll not use any of the names, but I want to select some of these Q-sort responses to be the data to input. And I'd rather not just take it randomly in the event that I ended up getting everybody from factor A or something like that. So if you'd put your name on it. And once you've done that, if we could take a, if you would, take about a 10-minute break, let's say, and then reassemble, and we'll go into the Q method program and get the results. And then some of these issues, the last 2 in particular, if you put those on hold, we'll bring those back up. Mark? Yeah. Did you say you wanted names or you didn't? Did, yes, yes. Yeah, if you would, please.